want to talk now, not in nearly as much depth as I did with the Inupiat culture, which I'm more familiar with, but I do want to talk somewhat about St. Lawrence Island Yupik, which is also a really, really fascinating cultural tradition. In many ways, St. Lawrence Island Yupik and Inupiat have a lot of similarities, and that's one of the reasons why they are grouped together in a single cultured area. A lot of things as far as whaling and walrus hunting, and the languages, although this is called Yupik, which would suggest, obviously, that their language is closely related to what we sometimes call Central Yupik or just Yupik south to them. It's also that language is also closely related to Inupiat. So there's lots and lots of similarities between St. Lawrence Island and Inupiat, but there are also some interesting differences between these two cultural traditions. And St. Lawrence Island and Yupik are just kind of it's like a fascinating cultural tradition for reasons we're about to get into. So, um, first of all, the first thing that's really interesting, this culture sometimes is called Siberian Yupik. You'll see people refer to it as, and that's partly because of this thing going on here. So if you're wondering what are these blue dots doing on a map of Alaska Native languages out in Russia, what you have there is communities of people, Yupikat people or Yupik people, who are living in either um, this part of Chukotka or this part in the Chukchi Peninsula. And you have Naukan Yupik community here and Cyrenaic here. Cyrenaic, unfortunately, the last native language speaker of it died back in the 1990s. I'm not sure if they're doing revitalization programs or not with their language, but traditionally, these are three different areas speaking effectively the same language. And a big chunk of those people, about 1,500 of them, live on St. Lawrence Island, which is part of Alaska, and about 1,000 of them live in Russia. And so again, a really good example of like we think of Alaska and Russia as fundamentally different, right? Like Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere, right? All that. But they're, literally like St. Lawrence Island and Russia are about 50 miles apart. Um, and so they're incredibly close together, and people were 100% interacting back in the day. And so you have people on the Russian side that are close, close, close language and cultural and genetic relatives of people out on St. Lawrence Island. By the way, St. Lawrence Island traditionally is known as Shivukak in St. Lawrence Island Yupik language. We're going to primarily focus on St. Lawrence Island rather than on the Siberian Yupik people that are out um, in Russia. So St. Lawrence Island can be thought of as a subset of Siberian Yupik, but for our purposes in this class, we will only focus on St. Lawrence Island Yupik rather than the Russian Siberian Yupik communities. People have been on St. Lawrence Island at least 2,000 years, according to archaeology. Nowadays, people on St. Lawrence Island predominantly live in two villages known as Gamble and Savunga, and about 1,500 people live on St. Lawrence Island. This is a picture of Savunga. Um, Subsistence traditionally involves a number of things, but one of them is a lot of hunting of walruses and whales as an absolute mainstay, seals, and then also reindeer. Reindeer are kind of have an interesting history here. If you're wondering, Dunstan, do you mean caribou? No, I do not mean caribou. I mean literally reindeer. So basically, reindeer were introduced by a Christian missionary right around 1900. By 1917, the herd had grown to 10,000. It grew very rapidly. It's not quite that big anymore, but you still have a large herd. I think it's like around 5,000 now. And so there's essentially this wild herd of reindeer. Again, rather than caribou, they're wild reindeer. So genetically, they're like or I guess behaviorally, they're like a domestic reindeer, but they're wild. Um, Traditionally, people have kind of this interesting dynamic where they are it's not quite a farm animal in the way that we think of like, oh, here's like a reindeer on a little reindeer farm in a little enclosure. They're like a wild roaming species, but people like from Savunga will like bring them in and like tag them and track them and like I think like even like vaccinate them and stuff like that. So it is like a wild animal herd that's also being kind of managed, kind of like a domestic herd. It's very interesting. When you take walrus, seal, whales, and reindeer together, that is 80% of the diet of St. Lawrence Island Yupik people. So very, very much like a traditional diet in that way, rather than one that's heavily dependent on grocery stores. People are heavily, heavily dependent on wild animals, and indeed for specific wild animals for most of their calories. So, by the way, the introduction of reindeers was partly in response to from I think it's 1888 to 1890 or 1878 to 1880, there was a very, very bad famine that affected St. Lawrence Island Yupik people. It appears to have partly been due to very strange weather that happened those 2 years, partly due to diseases that came in from Russian colonizers, and partly from over hunting or fishing, which would have been related also to Russian colonizers that were compelling people to work for them, and then people overhunting as a result. So there was a very, very large famine where many people died. And so reindeer were brought in partly as a way of countering the famine. So if you're wondering why was the Christian missionary bringing over reindeer and introducing them to St. Lawrence Island, that is part of what was going on there. Out on St. Lawrence Island, Yupik is still a very, very, very heavily used language, and indeed most people are bilingual in both English and St. Lawrence Island Yupik, with St. Lawrence Island Yupik arguably being the first language if we had to distinguish. Um, Indeed, when the whole population is mostly bilingual, it's a bit odd to distinguish which is first language, but since it's the native language, we would say St. Lawrence Island Yupik is the first language and the one that, kids are kind of first growing up with. Savunga, by the way, as one of the two big communities out there, essentially grew out of like a reindeer camp area. So people traditionally, of course, lived in that area for 2,000 years. But as far as like laying down roots and like, hey, we're going to build a bunch of houses right here, that has to do with the reindeer camp. This is a great quote by Pappy Merlin Kunuka from 2009. It's on the Smithsonian's website about St. Lawrence Island, Yupik. He's got several different quotes here that from an essay he wrote. I really like what he had to say. He talked about King Island, Yupik community, and he says marine mammals, fish, birds, eggs, reindeer, wild plants are important in the island. Diet throughout the year far more so than store-bought foods. On the tundra and mountainsides, people gather kokungak, willow leaf, nunavak, rosewood, angukak, dwarf fireweed, and various edible roots in late summer, cloudberry, and crowberry ripen. So you just kind of get a sense of that breadth of different traditional foods people are living on to this day. This is a picture of whaling back in the 1970s. Credit to Steve McCutcheon for a few of these pictures and Anchorage Museum. This is again a quote from Kunuka. He says, I'm a whaling captain like my grandfather, granduncles, and father before me. I serve on the AWC Whaling Commission. Traditionally, the captain prepared for whaling in a religious way, using charms, special songs, rituals that showed great respect we feel for this animal. While these rituals are no longer practiced, strict hunting protocols and the responsibility of the captain remain unchanged. A bowheaded whale so immense and powerful that hunters, even though armed with modern weapons, are really at its mercy. And then he says, and I found this fascinating, we use skin-covered boats and sails rather than motors, keeping absolute silence because whales have a very sharp sense of hearing, but they know we are there even if there is no sound. That is why we say that a whale decides to let itself be taken, not the other way around. So this recognition of they could escape us if we wanted to, they choose to be hunted. Um, I thought that was really interesting and beautiful. And I also thought it was really interesting that people, yes, have contemporary motorized boats, but they choose to use traditional skin-covered boats, specifically in the context of whaling, that is more effective than the motorized, loud, noisy boats. So newer forms of technology are not always better than traditional forms of technology. They are very often worse in certain ways. So um, walrus. This is somebody stretching out a walrus hide, and very cool picture. I liked it a lot. Walrus always have been essential to our way of life. We hunt them in open water and later on the frozen ocean, making use of nearly everything as food or material. The meat and fat are bundled into tuk, like kind of like balls of meat, to store in underground food cellars, and also for dogs. Um, Good quality hides of female walrus are stretched, split, cured, and stitched to cover the Yupik, the hunting boat. Walrus stomachs become heads for drums. Their intestines, ivory, and whiskers are transformed into adornment and art. Our predecessors used those skins to make tough rope and covers for the houses, the Nenglu, and interior Arga sleeping room. They spun walrus sinew into thread and carved the tusks into tools and sled runners. Talk about using every part of the animal possible. I thought that quote was fascinating. If you want to learn more about St. Lawrence Island Yupik or the Yupik people, the Smithsonian has a very good page on it with lots and lots of testimony from, that's where I was getting the Kunoka quotes from, and also has some very great pictures of traditional St. Lawrence Island Yupik communities and artifacts. So great page. Alaska Native Language Center, or ANLC, has a page, Siberian Yupik, that has good information. Kawarak Inc. has a great page specifically on the Sabunga community. I've linked to all of these. Hopefully you've found this interesting. I love learning about Inupiat culture and St. Lawrence Island Yupik culture. The longer I'm in Alaska, the more I learn, and it's fascinating to see how people have adapted to, again, life at the top of the world. Koyana.